All right. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Burton Lee, the head of medical education and global critical care at the National Institutes of Health. He earned his MD at Harvard Medical School, completed his internal medicine and critical care training at Mass Gen. He also trained in clinical effectiveness and evidence-based healthcare at the Harvard School of Public Health and Oxford University. He's just an absolute one-of-a-kind master educator, and we're honored to have you talk to us tonight, Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be back. It looks like you need to enable me to share the screen.
I think it is.
Okay, now it is. Yep, you are correct. Anyway. All right, so, all right. Can you all see my screen here?
Yes.
All right, so So this is actually part 2 of the talk on numeracy. And for those of you who tuned in last time, I talked about the concept of numeracy and especially this idea of apophenia and how that's so essential to our understanding and interpreting scientific literature. So this is part 2, and we're gonna talk about the concept of clinical ethics and especially as it applies to medical practice and research. And I'm going to start out by giving you a quick summary of, I think, the 2 seminal papers that I think is going to frame our discussion about this topic. So here's seminal paper number 1. This is a paper by Harvey. It's published in 2010 in the Journal of Neuroscience. And it's actually a pretty interesting paper in that they took a whole bunch of research subjects, 151 people actually, and they had them give their opinions about famous paintings. So you might recognize some of these that are shown here on the 3rd and 4th frame here. So for example, this 3rd one is one by Degas, I think, and it's of the ballerinas. And so, you know, some of you may have seen it hanging on a museum. But if you notice, there is a little symbol next to each of these paintings. And these symbols are slightly larger here. It represents 2 fictitious companies. And how the research is set up is that for each person who volunteers for this research study, they're given $300. And it's a pretty good gig because you get $300 for simply expressing your opinion about a painting. Now, it's not a complicated opinion. You don't have to be an artist. You don't have to have any culture or sophistication or any artistic background, actually. All you have to do is just say whether you like it or not. So it's just a rating of your personal liking without any background or any background in art at all. And so if you had volunteered for this, then you might be given this screen. It says this particular company is the one who gave you $300. Then you're asked to judge this painting, and in this case, you were paid by this company, but there's the other company's symbol here. And then as opposed to this painting, there's a logo of a company that you were paid by. Okay, and then now it turns out that the painting and the company logos were entirely random. And what they want to know was whether or not being paid by a company influences your rating or opinion about that painting. Okay, so the first part was that they simply asked the study subjects whether or not they felt that they were going to be influenced by whether or not that company had given you the $300. So what do you think people said? Well, basically, people said that, you know, we're more objective than that, and then that has really no bearing on how much we like it or not. But as you can probably guess from this, is that even though they did not think it affected the ratings, it actually did. So here is a rating in red if you happen to be sponsored by that particular company. Your rating was significantly higher as opposed to when your painting was not sponsored by the company. So now you could think about it. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? You know, some company paid you $300, so maybe you don't necessarily like the painting any better, but maybe you feel some social obligation, so you kind of say nicer things, okay? So that's one possibility. And the other possibility is that you sincerely like that painting better. And so there's two potential explanations. So the part that I didn't tell you about is that you weren't, these subjects were not looking at paintings on a wall, but they were actually lying in a functional MRI scanner, and these paintings were on the MRI. So as you're lying there in the machine, you're looking at these projections of these paintings. And what they noted was that actually for the majority of the subjects, the part of the brain that lit up is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is actually associated with preference and pleasure. So in other words, these people seem to genuinely like the paintings better when they were supported by the company. Okay. Now, if you kind of dwell on that a little bit and think through its implications, it's kind of scary, because it's one thing to say kind things because somebody was nice to you, okay? But for you to genuinely like it and not even realize that you've been manipulated, that's kind of a dangerous situation for you to be in. Now, the term for this concept is called reciprocity. So, that's a fairly ordinary English word as well. But all that says is that if you are nice to me, I'm going to be nice to you. And again, there's nothing wrong with reciprocity. It is a good thing. In fact, that's what society is sort of built on. And much of our familial relationships and friendships are based on reciprocity. So reciprocity in itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing. But the question becomes is what happens when there's reciprocity in medical practice or in scientific research? And that begins to open up a whole new set of questions. So let's think about reciprocity. So here is a one list that actually has major US politicians who are paid by drug companies. And, I did check to see among the top 20 people, it's a fairly even distribution of Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't point out one political party over the other. But as you can see, there's a significant amount of money, this is in millions of dollars here, that our politicians receive. And as you know, many of these people are actually making laws and then voting about healthcare issues. More directly is this more recent paper in October of 2022, which talks about federal government officials who actually own and trade stocks in companies that they directly oversee. So I believe this is not supposed to happen, but as you can see, on the average, it's about 1 in 5, or about 20% of senior officials actually trade stocks in areas that they're supposed to oversee. Now, I'm sure if you were to ask them, does that impact your decision-making? They're all going to say no, but it's hard to really believe that it does not have an impact. Now, getting more into the topic at hand, which is, the topic of scientific evidence, here is actually an interesting study in Annals of Internal Medicine from 2014, and then Dunn and the team looked at a whole bunch of systematic reviews looking at the efficacy of neuraminidase inhibitors for influenza. So this is like Tamiflu, for example. So what they did was they divided the systematic reviews where there was a conflict of interest among the authors versus those that did not have a conflict of interest. Okay. In other words, authors had some industry connection to Roche and other companies that make Tamiflu, and they wanted to know what was the conclusion of the systematic review. Does that influence what they conclude in their paper? So, and this probably isn't shocking at this point since what we already just discussed. But if you had a conflict of interest, that is, one or more of the authors had some financial ties to the company that makes Tamiflu, 88% of those systematic reviews said this drug seems to work. In contrast, very few of the ones that did not have a conflict of interest said that this class of drugs has any real efficacy. Okay? So this idea of reciprocity is something very important for us to think about. Now, if you look at another level of like more in the clinical practice that is based on research, let's think about guidelines. You know, there are a lot of guidelines that are out there. And so here's a paper, it's pretty classic now, but it's in BMJ 2011. And, you know, and this team looked at when a North American clinical guideline gets published from the years 2000 to 2010, they looked just at 2 years before and 1 year after publication. So it's a fairly narrow window of time. And then they asked, do the panelists have any conflict of interest? And if you didn't know this before, it's actually pretty disturbing to think that, for example, of the 15 panelists in the American Diabetic Association 2010 guidelines, 87% of them had a conflict of interest. Okay. And then here are 12 panelists in the American Academy of Cardiology, which I think many of you might be interested in. Again, 83% of them had a conflict of interest. Now, generally speaking, if you had a government-sponsored guideline like the NIH guidelines, the conflict of interest was less common, okay? But if you had a specialty guidelines like the American Diabetic Association, American Heart Association, et cetera, it was actually much more common. Similarly, this is a paper just looking at, well, what about the chairs, you know, who sort of make the agendas and sort of drive these panels, and the co-chairs? Well, 71% of the chairs had a conflict of interest, and 90% of the co-chairs had some financial conflict of interest. So, you know, so guidelines may not be free of bias as we would all hope. So let's then move on to a second seminal paper, which I think is really fascinating and really important for us to, again, set the framework for the rest of the talk. So the second paper is by Mazar, and this starts out with a kind of an anecdote, which is kind of a fun thing to think about. So what this team did was they went to MIT into their college dormitory, and I think you know, I'm sure all of you will be familiar with this kind of a dormitory setup where the students, you know, live in one area, and then in the middle is a common kitchen that they all share, and within the common kitchen there is a common refrigerator. And so what they did was they walked up to one of the dormitories and they put 6 individual cans of Coke in the refrigerator, no name, no explanation, no warning, you know, don't take this, okay? They just left it there, and they came back 72 hours later to see how many cans of Coke would essentially survive a college dormitory, okay? So, you know, just kind of, you know, think to yourself, what do you think the mortality of cans of Coke are in a college dormitory after 72 hours? Well, probably not shocking to most of you, nothing survived. It was 100% mortality. They were all taken, okay? So, you know, that's not really shocking. After all, there was no name or no warning or anything like that. And so I'm sure college students were thirsty and they just took advantage of the Coke. The part that's really interesting now is then these researchers then decided to go to a different dormitory. And this time, instead of 6 cans of Coke, they put 6 $1 bills in the refrigerator. So that's a little odd, but they also wanted to see whether these dollar bills will survive the 72 hours. So now think a little bit about what you think would happen. Okay, so normally when I give this talk live, you know, I would have you debate this for a little bit, but given the Zoom nature, I think I'm going to not do that per se. But it's still worth for you to, you know, maybe think out, at least to yourself, what do you think would happen? to 6 $1 bills. Because it's really fascinating because in contrast to the Cokes, actually there was 100% survival of these 6 $1 bills. And so the question is, why is there a discrepancy? Now, the part that I left out here is that in the kitchen, besides the refrigerator, there is also another machine there. And guess what that machine was? Well, some of you are probably going to guess it, but it's a vending machine. And vending machines sold what? Soda cans, including Coke. And guess how much that Coke cost? It was $1. Okay. So if you think about this initial study, it's really fascinating, right? Because for some reason, the MIT students had no qualms about taking 6 cans of Coke, but for some reason, nobody felt like they should take $1 bills, even though obviously with the vending machine there, it's identical. They're 2 items of equal value. And yet there was a totally discrepancy in their behavior. So to flesh this out a little bit, now they're doing a little bit more sophisticated version of this paper. So again, let me summarize this here. So if you remember, this was MIT. So as you know, MIT students are generally going to be very good in math. And so what they did here was they gave these students a math test. And they were given just 5 minutes, however, so they didn't have a lot of time. But they were asked to solve up to 20 math questions. And for each question that they get correct, they get $10, which means they have the opportunity to earn as much as $200 in this 5-minute experiment. So again, not a bad deal. Okay, so here's the first part of the experiment. And so let's say all of you signed up to be part of this. What would happen is you would get a test, and then I would be the proctor, and I'd be in the room. And the 5 minutes, the bell would go off. I would ask you to put your pens down, and then you would turn in your exams to me, and then I would grade them. And so if one of you got a 10, I'd give you $100. And if one of you got a 5, I'd give you $50 and so forth. Okay. So now here's the outcome. As you can see, even for MIT students, the mean score was only 3.5. So because of the time limitations and because there's so many questions to answer, it wasn't enough time to answer, that many. So the mean was 3.5. And then here's the highest score among hundreds of people who took this test. The highest was 10. Okay. So, which of course means that nobody got a perfect score. So this is important just to establish that on a statistical basis, it is unlikely that a human being can get a perfect score. Okay, so does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so that's the baseline, and then the second part of the research is now they get a different group of students. And what they describe doing is very similar to before. You all get a test. I'm the proctor. The major difference here is instead of you turning in the test, is now you grade your own exam papers. Okay, so you get to decide what the final score is, essentially. Okay. Now, to make it more interesting, not only do you grade your own paper, you then write down your score on a different small piece of paper. So that little square piece of paper will say 7 or 8 or 20, whatever you decide to write down. And then finally, you are then asked to shred your original test paper. Okay. In other words, there's no way for me to prove, or for anyone to prove, that you are cheating or exaggerating your score. Okay. So then you, given the opportunity to shred, you of course now have the opportunity to cheat. So what do you think happens to the score? Okay. Well, I think most of you will probably realize that, well, certainly some people are going to cheat. And so as you might guess, the scores increased. And now the highest score was a 20 out of 20, which we already proven is not possible for human beings, statistically speaking. Okay. Now, what's interesting here is that what percentage of people claimed a 20 out of 20? And this is worth thinking about because remember, there's no way for you to get caught, and you are playing for money after all. And so it would make sense that actually maybe a lot of people would claim 20 out of 20. Okay. Well, it turned out that it was a tiny, tiny fraction of people who actually claimed the 20 out of 20. Now, the way the researchers put this together is they say, well, most people are liars, or actually probably all of us are liars, and all of us are likely to cheat. Okay, but given this tiny fraction who cheat maximally, okay, most of us are stopped at a certain level, either because of our mothers come to mind, or because God comes to mind, or some other conscience comes to mind. And so we don't cheat all the way, is the explanation. However, as you can see, there are some people who seem to be sociopathic, that they don't have that conscience that most of us have, and they are willing to cheat all the way. But fortunately for society, the percentage of sociopaths are, it's actually very small, so which is a good thing. Okay. All right. So then let's finish up this last part of the seminal study. And now this is yet another group of MIT students who don't know what's happened in the previous experiments. And so the setup is similar again, where you are given the test. I'm the proctor. You grade the exam yourself. And again, you shred the original test paper. And you write down your score on a little piece of paper. But instead of you turning in that sheet and me giving you money directly, you are given some type of a token. So let's say, like poker chips, for example. Okay, you're given a token for each question that you say you get right. So if you claim that you got 5 is your score, I would give you 5 wooden tokens. And if you say I got a 20, I'll give you 20 tokens. And then you would take those tokens, walk down the hall, and then from somebody else, you would turn in the tokens and then get $10 for each token. Okay. So in other words, it's really similar to part B, except for the introduction of a token. Okay. So now, again, it's worth thinking about what would happen to the score. And again, if this was a live, in-person audience, I'd have you debate this because it's quite entertaining to see what people say. But again, in your own mind, just kind of take a guess. Will the scores go down? Will the scores stay the same? Or will it go up? Okay. Well, what's interesting here is it actually went up significantly. So it went up even further to about 9.4. So the amount of cheating significantly increased. And of course, the highest score was, again, 20, just like it had been before. But the most important part of this is that the percent of people who are willing to be sociopathic here actually dramatically increased. Okay. And again, this is very important to kind of frame our discussion because, so we'll call this the token effect. And just like people were willing to steal Coke, but not take $1 bills, even though they're equivalent, people are more willing to cheat, according to this research, if it involves not cash, but a token. And so what these researchers argue is that in much of modern society, we actually don't deal with cash anymore. We actually deal with tokens. And so they hypothesize that maybe the level of sociopathy, level of cheating and dishonest behavior may be higher because of the token effect. So for example, let's think about a dishonest person in your neighborhood, okay? And since we're all healthcare workers, let's pick on a lawyer. So let's say a lawyer is a dishonest person, okay? But if that person, even if that person is very dishonest, it is extremely unlikely that person is going to physically take $500 from an old lady, let's say. Okay, that just is unlikely to happen. However, that same lawyer may be quite willing to manipulate something on the contract or to change something, essentially use a token to steal money from people. Okay. And maybe the politicians, it's the same thing, that a politician is unlikely to mug somebody or rob a bank, okay? But that politician may be quite willing to just change something in the law or to use some loopholes for their own financial gain. And then now coming back to our field of medicine, again, doctors, for the most part, don't participate in direct cash transactions. Instead, we use insurance companies, we bill, and we use essentially secondary or tokens to get paid. And so what impact might that have on healthcare practices? Similarly, for research, again, researchers are unlikely to take cash and to steal, but perhaps researchers might feel more comfortable dropping data sets or fabricating one data point to get across that p-value threshold of 0.05, okay? Or maybe, somehow influencing the randomization and allocation process, some things that are a little more subtle. Okay? So let's see what impact these things have. So here is here's some examples of how reciprocity and token effect might impact medical practice. So, for example, here is an article in the New York Times from 2012, where a hospital in Florida was actually discovered to be doing unnecessary cardiac interventions. So these are essentially people with normal coronaries, but they were doing invasive stents and so forth, obviously because you get paid more, doing stents than just doing angiography. And then, one of the nurses actually basically turned the hospital in. And, in case you think this might be some isolated event, the exact same year in August of 2012, here was a hospital in Maryland, actually, that was doing essentially the same thing, where inappropriate procedures were being done. And in case you think it's something that's limited to the East Coast of the country, here's actually a book called Coronary that I would encourage you to read. It's actually from state of California, where a team of cardiologists and cardiac surgeons were actually conspiring to perform unnecessary cabbages, bypass surgeries on people who didn't need them. So some really horrendous examples of token effect. So you may have seen something like this. This comes from the from the Dartmouth website. This is it's a website that's looking at, for example, the overall quality of medical care. So they're looking at some of the top evidence-based recommendations and how often those evidence practices are being done. So here is 1 down to 51 because it includes the District of Columbia. And so the top are over here, of course, and the bottom is over here. So on the x-axis is actually how much money is spent per capita. So the more money we spend is actually lower quality of care. And I think some of these might be too hard to read, but I think down here is actually Texas and California and Florida and so forth. And, as you know, not only because of, like conflict of interest and things like that, but there's a lot of what we consider as medical waste. And so you're probably aware of the Choosing Wisely campaign that is trying to get physicians to stop doing things that are not evidence-based or things that are wasteful. So, and then, like some of the researchers actually point out that if you look at all of the, what they call in this paper ethics-related medical waste, okay, it's kind of a polite term for all the fraud and things like that that happens in medical care. It's actually $395 billion each year, and that is probably like the gross domestic product of some small countries. But in contrast, what most of us think as being theft, robbery, burglary, larceny, major theft, that's actually only $16 billion. So we as physicians are responsible for a lot more of this kind of behavior. Let's get into some of the other examples now for medical research in particular. So here's a very interesting paper that I think is worthy to bring out. This paper actually comes from University of Pittsburgh, and is looking at applicants who are applying to the GI fellowship. So I think most of you know that within internal medicine, certainly cardiology and GI are probably the two of the most competitive specialties. And then you all know that one of the ways to really distinguish yourself for an application to a competitive field is for you to publish papers. So this is an old paper from 1995, but what they did was they took all the applicants that University of Pittsburgh got for GI, which back then was 236 applications, and they looked at people who said, I have published a paper. And so what they did was they waited 18 months after the application cycle was over to give it plenty of time. Then they used one of these means to verify whether or not they're telling the truth. Okay, so if the applicant included a copy of the article, they consider that as being, yes, it looks like that person has published it. Then they hired a librarian to do a Medline search, and of course, if it was on Medline, that was confirmation that yes, this person did indeed publish it. If a letter of recommendation said that they published it, that they took that as proof as well. And then they did some more exhaustive searches through the National Library of Medicine and something called the Ulrichs International Periodicals Directory. All of this is to say is they waited 18 months because they didn't want to deal with this in-press kind of a situation, and they gave it plenty of time for that to be resolved. And then they went through exhaustive means to see if an applicant claimed that they published a paper, then how often are they not telling the truth? Okay, so again, it's worth for you to think about, is this something that you would even consider doing? Because this is fairly easily verifiable, right? This is not something that's that hard to really prove. Well, what may be interesting to you is actually 30% of the applicants who said they published the paper, it turns out was what they call non-verifiable. Okay, and so stop and pause for this for a second, because what happens, first of all, if these types of people or this type of behavior goes on and they do publish papers, right? Then will the research be trustworthy? And then people point out that something like this is actually quite easily verifiable. But what happens if an applicant says, "Oh, I worked in Uganda for a year taking care of these orphans," things like that, because no one's going to really go out there and to try to prove or disprove any of that stuff, because we take things at face value for in most circumstances. So now coming back to medical research further, so here's a pretty classic paper by Els Nielsen. And so what they did here was they took a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials that were found in randomly selected Cochrane reviews. So as you know, this is a systematic review. So in systematic reviews, they're able to compare some randomized controlled trials against others that is examining the exact same PICO question. Okay, so the same subject matter, but they're able to divide them into randomized controlled trials that were shown to be nonprofit supported, profit supported. So in other words, a drug company, for example, or some mixed funding. And then they're able to categorize what was the conclusion of that randomized controlled trial on a scale of 1 through 6. So if you look at scale 1, the conclusion of the paper is that the new experimental drug or intervention didn't really work, so the control should remain the standard of care. In contrast, a 6 is the opposite, that the new drug or new treatment is so much more effective than the control that should now be the standard of care. And then everything in between is 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So of all the 370 RCTs put together, the median score, first of all, was a 5, and 36% of them were a 6. Okay. But if you break it down by the conflict of interest here, from nonprofit to mixed to for-profit, you can probably guess what they find is it goes from 4, 5, and 6. And then the percent that claim a 6 goes from 16% all the way up to 50 plus percent. Okay. And as a concrete example of something like this, this is actually a pretty humorous paper, but it's a paper looking at 42 RCTs of head-to-head comparisons of second-generation antipsychotics for schizophrenia. Okay, so these are drugs like olanzapine and quetiapine and things like that. Okay, so it's a head-to-head comparison, meaning the two active drugs are being compared to one another. Okay, so there's not a placebo group here, but it's two drugs that are saying our drug is better than their drug, kind of thing. Okay, and so they took these studies, and they noted that most of them, 78% of them, were funded by industry. Okay, and what they looked at was of the 42 RCTs that they looked at, the conclusion favoring the funding source was actually 90%. Now, if you stop and think about that, if 90% of the time, whatever study you do, it favors the funding source, okay, you almost don't need to even do the study, right? Because why bother enrolling patients and spending all that time and money when you pretty much know the answer, okay? And so the title of this paper actually has to do with this concept, right? So let's say there are 3 people and I'm one of them, okay? So let's just say hypothetically that person to my left is shorter than me, okay? So the person to my left is A, I'm person B, okay? And then let's just say that I am taller than the person to my left, okay? Well, if there's a third person and the third person is taller than me, okay, then there should be a logical conclusion here. What do you think about the first person and the third person? Okay, if I'm taller than the person to my left, but I'm shorter than the person to my right, then person to my right should be taller than the person to my left. Okay, that would only be scientifically logical. So the title of this paper is actually, why does olanzapine beat risperidone, and risperidone beat quetiapine, and quetiapine beat olanzapine? And the basic conclusion, of course, is that it's really whoever is funding the study is what is shown to be superior in terms of efficacy. So here is another example that comes from the New England Journal of Medicine, and if you're not aware of this, this is a family of studies called the DECREASE trials. It's the acronym is HERE, but the lead author here is Don Poterman, and this is a paper that actually changed medical practice for a handful of years actually throughout the world. And what this paper showed was that when they took patients undergoing major vascular surgery, perioperative use of beta blockers significantly reduced mortality and other major complications. So not only this paper, but several other papers like by the same group, show this. And so this actually changed medical practice, and it became so emphasized that, for example, if you're an anesthesiologist or a surgeon or a hospital, you might actually get penalized if you were not giving beta blockers to your patient undergoing, major vascular surgery. Well, if you are not aware of this study, it actually turns out that this study was actually fabricated. This is not a common thing, fortunately, but unfortunately, it's not rare either, where actually data is fabricated. And so when they try to look at the data, it turns out that there was no data set that they could find, for this. And here is one sort of a lay magazine article in Forbes where they say, medicine or mass murder, because the guidelines that resulted from this particular paper, they estimate may have killed about 800,000 people in Europe over 5 years. So something that you have to be aware of. Now, here's another example. This is actually a researcher who's written a book about honesty and ethics. So the honest truth about dishonesty. And actually just this last year, even this person who does research on honesty was accused of actually fabricating their own data for at least some parts of his research. Okay, and these are the two studies that are actually being allegedly fabricated. So as we wrap up, let's think about a more common type of issue, because like outright fraud, it does happen, but that's not the most common type. But let's look at this paper by Gaudino, and they're looking at 216 randomized trials over this time period, and the subject matter are various cardiovascular interventions. Okay, so here is essentially a survey of the land for cardiac literature. So of the 216 RCTs, 115 or 53% had industry sponsorship, so a little more than half. Okay, now again, these studies are expensive, so I'm not saying that that it's always bad, of course, and sometimes the ones who want to put in the money are the ones who have some stake in it, like they want to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that in of itself. But the net result is that these sponsorships is common, but what's more disturbing is that in 42% of the cases, that is 48 out of 115, that conflict of interest is not even declared in the publication. So if you look for it, you can't even find it. Okay. And then when they look at 84 studies that were negative trials, if you really look at the study carefully, that the drug or the intervention did not work. But if you notice, 55 out of 84, or 65% of the negative trials, were spun so that it looked like it's a positive finding. Okay. So what I actually encourage my students and residents and fellows to do is, because not all of the conflict of interest are actually listed or actually declared, what I encourage them to do is actually for any major paper that you really care a lot about, you should actually look up, unfortunately, at least the first two authors and the senior author, who is generally the last person, okay? And then look them up on Open Payments Data, which is a government website. And by law, in the US, you are required to, the drug companies are required to list how much money is given to different physicians and scientists. Okay, Now, it doesn't help if you're not an American, because this is only for the US database, okay? But at least it's some way for you to look. And then if you start looking things up, you'll be surprised how often there's a conflict of interest that is not publicly, declared. So here is an example from the critical care world. So this is a paper called Accuracy Study. This is a study of using a paralytic medication called cisatracurium for patients with ARDS. And this is a paper that was published back in 2010. And what they registered as their primary outcome for the study was 90-day mortality. Okay. In other words, alive or dead at 90 days. So it's the percent that is, that is dead at 90 days that is being compared for the two groups, those who got cisatracurium and those who did not. So in their own publication, that's what they also say. So not only did they register this on their website, but they also said that their primary outcome was a proportion or the percentage of patients who died before the hospital discharge and within 90 days after study enrollment. So the 90-day mortality rate. Okay, so far so good. But then if you look, this is what they report in the results. Okay, they actually said, well, now they're calling it the crude 90-day mortality rate was 31.6% with cisatracurium and 40.7% with a placebo group with a p-value of 0.08. And then they say that if you do a Cox regression, okay, the p-value is now 0.04. It's magically less than 0.05. Okay. So if you are here for the last talk, remember we talked about the importance of registration and primary outcome. And if you notice, that's what they registered. That's what they said was, was a primary outcome. And now they're changing it to a Cox regression or an adjusted outcome. So now that may be okay if the two findings are the same. That is, they're both significant and they're both show a benefit of cisatracurium. But what they did was that they adjusted for three things, he says: PF ratio, SAPS-2 score, and plateau pressure. Okay. And if you look at the registry, what they said they were going to do was they're going to adjust for SAPS-2 and plateau pressure. In other words, post hoc, they're also adjusting for PF ratio. Okay, so they're doing a post hoc adjustment with a third variable. Now, what's worse than a post hoc adjustment is if you understand what a SAPS score is, and I'm showing you an example of a SAPS score actually already includes the PF ratio. Okay, so if you're following, they adjusted for PF ratio here once, and then they're doing it again, because that's how you get under the p-value of 0.05. Okay, so this is the kind of spin that happens in journal articles all the time. Okay, and now what do you think they will find if you were to repeat this experiment again? Well, about 5 years later, they actually repeated this study called the PEDAL trial, and guess what they found? Absolutely no significant difference between cisatracurium and control. So, but I would argue it was entirely predictable if you understood what they did here. It was all spin. Now this is a somewhat controversial topic, but I think many people say, well, we shouldn't really be penalizing industry sponsorship because RCTs are expensive and somebody has to pay for it, and that's all true. But also they bring out the fact that actually industry sponsored studies are of quote unquote higher quality, and that's also shown as in the study. So, for example, when they looked at systematic reviews of 75 comparisons between industry versus non-industry sponsored studies, an industry sponsorship meant that you are more likely to have a favorable result. but there was no difference in one of the quality measures, which is allocation concealment. So it was not any worse, but actually blinding, it was actually done better. So in other words, if you look at conventional risk of bias tools that Cochrane and other groups use and advocate for, industry sponsors trials will actually look like they're higher quality. But what the authors here conclude is that this discrepancy cannot be explained by the standard risk of bias assessment. So the controversy is some people argue that, you should look at studies without considering the funding source, just look at quality measures like allocation concealment and blinding. Okay, and the people who say that is because, well, that's not really fair to penalize just because a drug company sponsored it. You can't just say automatically that's a bad study. Okay, and there is some merit in that. But others say you have to think about the funding source, because if you look at the traditional measures of quality, like blinding and allocation concealment, actually they have more money to spend, so they will make a better trial in that sense. But there's still the issue of reciprocity and token effect, and there's a lot of spin, and they will manipulate things like I just showed you about adjustments and so forth. Okay, so some checklists include the funding source, some do not. My personal, bias, as you can probably tell, is that I think you have to consider the funding source. Okay, but not everybody would agree with this point. One quick point about peer review. I think you know that there are traditional journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, for example, where somebody has to pay for those journals. So often the library has to pay for it, or individual physician has to pay for that, and that's costly. But there've been a lot of complaints, especially from the from the global health community, that says, we can't afford those kind of subscription fees, et cetera. And so now there are these open access journals that you're probably well aware of, where it's free, so anyone from anywhere in the world can access it. So in theory, it's a brilliant idea where somebody from Africa who might not have the same resources as those in the U.S. can have access to these open access journals. In fact, in my work, I actually spent about 6 years of my career in Kenya. And in that work, I would say, a lot of my Kenyan colleagues would use open access journals for that reason, because it was freely available to them. Okay, but here is one interesting angle to that, is because these open access journals are of course not completely free. Somebody has to pay for that, and I think that the people who pay for that are actually the authors. So for you to get published, you have to pay them anywhere from $500 to sometimes $5,000 or more to get your article published, which means what is the motivation of the publisher? Well, the motivation is to just publish with relatively poor peer review, because that's how you get paid as a journal. So there's been all these kind of, all these funny papers that's been coming out showing how shoddy at least some open access journals can be. So here's my favorite one from 2014. Spears is actually a journalist for a Canadian newspaper here. And what he did was he heard about these, about the poor quality peer review in open access journals. So he made up his own fake paper, and here's the picture of it here. So the summary of this is that he took 3 real papers, one from a geology journal, another from a hematology journal, and another from a wine science journal. All he did was copied and pasted from 3 real journals. So if you understand what that means, the entire paper is plagiarized because he just simply copied and pasted from real journals, okay? And because it's a combination of geology and hematology, he made up fake terms like seismic platelets, okay? And then he put in the picture of Mars because he thought that it looked pretty cool. And he put in unrelated graphs because the graphs, were colorful and just looked good. And then he used, names of baseball players and senators. The universities of these people were all fake, and he submitted it to 18 different open access journals to see what would happen. And this is what happened. Only 1 of the 18 rejected it. 8 of the 18, for some reason, did not respond. 8 accepted this paper, and one, this is my favorite one, actually asked them to revise something so that then they would publish it. I'm not sure what they wanted to revise from this kind of a paper, but that's what happened. So you got to be careful, because I think in some cases, of course, is stuff like this is a source of disinformation that's affecting, I think, this whole world right now. But actually, sometimes during rounds, I'll have like a resident, actually quoting articles that are from these kinds of journals. So make sure you are aware of this problem. And like I said, a lot of my colleagues from the developing world are not always aware of this either, but this is what's available to them. Okay. So I think that brings me to the end. So I think I'll stop here and take any questions if you have anything. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. That was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you.